This GeekWire podcast is brought to you by BECU. Stay tuned to the break as Brian Westbrook interviews BECU's Stacy Black for today's money hack on how to stop living paycheck to paycheck. For more money hacks, check out geekwire.com/BECU. I talked to you in 2008 when I was a reporter for one of the newspapers, the Seattle PI. Right when you were leaving Microsoft, we were fortunate enough to speak with you in your office on one of your last days. I asked you about the perception that you'd mellowed over time. And do you remember what you said?
Maybe, I hope not, or I'm embarrassed that that's true, or...
You said bullshit.
Okay, good. I think I was making a joke.
You were.
That is good.
It was a good one. Hi, everybody. It's Todd Bishop from GeekWire, and recently I got a chance to sit down with Bill Gates for a wide-ranging conversation in advance of the release of his new memoir, Source Code: My Beginnings. We're presenting this interview in two parts, this one focusing on Gates's new book, the extraordinary story of his upbringing in Seattle and his early interest in technology, and where the world is headed from here. On an upcoming episode, as part of our Microsoft at 50 series, we'll hear Bill Gates' thoughts on the evolution of the company that he and Paul Allen started 5 decades ago, the opportunities ahead in artificial intelligence, and what's next for Microsoft and the broader tech industry. Here's part one of our interview with Bill Gates. Bill Gates, thank you for sitting down with me. We always appreciate you making time for GeekWire.
Great to see you.
So your book, Source Code: My Beginnings, it's a memoir really about the extraordinary circumstances of your early years in Seattle and Harvard and the very early stages of Microsoft in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I've read it, I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I have lots of deep and meaningful questions that I want to ask you during our time here together. But I have to start, based on our past conversations, by giving you a little bit of a hard time. There's no mention of Burger Master in this book.
That's true. Or Dick's. Where's the cuisine?
Exactly. Well, no, you talked a little bit about Burger Train and other places that you would go to celebrate your business deals. But of course, you will be having 2 more installments, if I understand correctly, in this memoir. So you'll have a little bit of time later on in those editions to talk about Seattle's iconic burger chain. So
at the end of this book, we're just moving back to Seattle,
yes.
1979. And, Microsoft only has about 18 employees. And so the real Microsoft and Seattle story is just beginning.
And I'm looking forward to that second installment. But I have to tell you, this was really a remarkable experience to read this book. It felt like someone was taking a familiar black and white sketch, filling it out, and painting it in color. Just your whole life story, and especially the early years. And it's got some fascinating twists and turns. What do you hope people will take away from this book and from your story of growing up?
Well, I was unbelievably lucky, and I had a lot of fun talking about my mom, who was amazing, and I had a complicated relationship with her that, somehow motivated me. My dad, I have such incredible admiration for the example he set. There's a lot of times in my early career where he helps out. And I learned a lot from him. And then, the 2 other people who are prominent in this phase of my life are Kent Evans, who tragically dies when I'm in 11th grade, and then Paul, who was 2 years ahead of me at Lakeside. But then after Kent is killed, he comes back and helps me with the scheduling program. And we, got very intense in terms of, okay, we're going to start a company when, what, from that summer of the scheduling, we kind of had that commitment. So 18 months ago, the idea of just taking this first part and really going through that and talking about, my luck and the great things my parents did raising me, that came together and, started to really make sense that this would give us a chance to, kind of delve into all the pieces that make me, 1979, so committed to software and kind of in almost a unique position of seeing how important software will be.
You mentioned Kent, and it really struck me the depth of your friendship with him, your relationship with him, and I couldn't help but wonder, because as you acknowledge at the end of the book, you were destined to do something together as adults, to work together. He introduced you to the concept of software licensing, and a lot of the business principles that he would research. Do you ever stop and think what Microsoft or whatever you would have created might have been like had he lived?
Yeah, at the end of the book, I fly out on a seaplane from my house on Lake Washington out to Alderbrook, a resort out on Hood Canal. And I run into Marvin Evans, Kent's father, which is like, wow, hadn't seen him for quite a while. And he and I reminisced about, boy, those early days set the trajectory that led to Microsoft, and it would have been great to have Kent as part of that. It's hard to know, but Kent did a couple of things for me. He, even in 8th and 9th grade, was thinking, okay, should we be ambassadors or generals or CEOs? And I was like, what? And, okay, which of those jobs is more fun? Who makes more money? And I was like, oh, God. And, he got me reading Fortune magazine. So he had this very, out in the world thing. He was also in some ways more, he was getting good grades across the board. He was in the independent study where I was still kind of in this, hey, act like I don't care, except in math, and not, work as hard. But he was very intense. And so, he was by far my closest friend. There were 4 of us, the 2, Rick and Paul, who were 2 years ahead of us. And we were closer than you'd think, given that 2-year gap, because we were spending all this time in the computer room. But, Kent was the one I was talking to every night and, brainstorming about things. And Paul, by the time I'm a junior in high school, he's gone off and does his first year at Washington State University. And I've committed to Lakeside School to do the full year scheduling. I had kind of patched up the trimester by trimester mess because I had figured out how to do it. But I needed help to get that done. And so that really is when my relationship with Paul strengthened, and he sort of stepped in to the role that Kent would have played. Now, Paul in his own way was very unique. Paul was the one reading about Moore's Law and telling me this exponential improvement thing, which I was like, Paul, do you know that's mind-blowing. Everybody should be, running around shouting because that means computing will be free. So, I got the benefit of Kent's unique thinking and Paul's unique thinking, and even Rick, although to a lesser degree.
Paul was also the person who introduced you to LSD.
That's right. He got me drunk. He gave me pot. This guy was a problem. Jimi Hendrix. I mean, he made me listen to that music.
I love it because you've got the multiple forces in your life with the people around you. Of course, your mom was this stabilizing force with high expectations. Your dad would ask, "Are you organized?" as his way of saying, "Do you have your life in order?" And Paul would ask, "Are you experienced?"
No, Paul loved handing me challenges, so the original thing, where that computer terminal is there and people are befuddled by it. I had done so well on a math exam that Paul was literally the one who said, oh yeah, you think you're so smart. Can you figure this thing out? And kind of drew me into it. And I brought Kent along. And so that really, by the time a month or two had gone by, we were the super intense there all the time for people.
Hearing you talk about this era and seeing you light up as you do, I can tell you've been reliving this through the process of writing
Absolutely.
this book. What has it been like for you to revisit these years? I can imagine it might be painful at times because there's some painful introspection that happens, but what have you learned about yourself through this process of writing this first memoir?
It's not my normal thing to be looking backwards. I mean, even when Microsoft would have our, 10th anniversary, I'd be like,
what's next?
Hey, we got to survive and move faster than everybody else. And this looking backwards thing, I don't know. But, because I'm turning 70, Microsoft turning 50, the foundation 25, my dad would have been 100. It actually has been very interesting, making sure I explain all these different opportunities I got. Talking about my relationship with my mom. My dad, I was 10 times more time interacting with my mom, because my dad goes to work early, he comes back and at dinner time. But, he was so amazing. And I have a lot of, cases, I think 3 cases where my dad, in the relationship with ISI on the payroll program, a time at Harvard when I almost get in trouble, and then business dispute with our first customer, Mitts, where my dad, offers very good advice and helps me stay, focused on solving the problem. And so, the appreciation of my dad and his role, and of course later he helps start the Gates Foundation. He and Patty Stonecipher are the first CEOs of the foundation. The luck I had with my parents is just incredible. And, so I do, when I'm working on this, it actually is slower than normal things. So give me 50 pages to edit, and it'll take 3 times longer than I think, because I'm kind of thinking back to those days. And I remember it all very vividly. My sister Christy, who read it and said, "Oh, this is fantastic." She's like, "How did you remember all these things?" Well, partly Rob Guth is going and, talking to everybody who's still around and getting my report cards. I thought I got straight A's in 9th grade. It turns out I got a B. I was, shocked that my recollection was so kind to myself that, I try to be careful about fooling myself. And in that case, I had done that.
Rob Guth, the former Wall Street Journal reporter who's now on your team, reading this book made me think everybody should have a journalist who, as they're approaching their 70s, go back and research their lives. Although, as you say, there might be some surprises in there. Coming up, Bill Gates' complicated relationship with his parents and why he has decided to acknowledge for the first time publicly that he'd likely be diagnosed on the autism spectrum if he were growing up today. This GeekWire podcast is brought to you by BECU. Stay tuned as Brian Westbrook interviews BECU's Stacy Black for today's Money Hack on how to stop living paycheck to paycheck. And for more money hacks, check out geekwire.com/BECU.
Are you living paycheck to paycheck? Help is on the way. Lead financial educator for BECU, Stacy Black, is here with me. You have some tips. What should people know?
Number 1, avoid quick fixes like payday loans or pawn shops. They seem like they're going to do the trick, but it just puts us in a deeper hole. And I would say look big picture, long term. Think about what resources are out there and available to you, and check with your financial institution. I know BECU has a lot of great resources for our members.
What if you are feeling like you're alone? What would you say?
You are not alone. 62% of us are living paycheck to paycheck. And so it's pretty prevalent. Just know that you're not alone and there is help available.
More advice and tips and tricks from Stacy Black, lead financial educator for BECU, is available on Money Hacks at geekwire.com/BECU.
Listen to the full interview and find more episodes of Money Hacks at geekwire.com/BECU and find more information at becu.org. I want to circle back to some of the themes from the book. Some of the details are just amazing when viewed through the lens of 2025, like a young kid sneaking out of his house at night to jump on the bus and go to the computer lab, coming home in the early hours of the morning, and your parents not knowing. That's the thing that struck me. And, you were hiking in the wilderness for days at a time, writing a version of BASIC in your head, and you finally knew you had it. I mean, there's just some really remarkable things. And yet, at the same time, around you is this amazing support structure. And your parents, Bill Sr. and Mary Gates, they set a very high bar in parenting. In fact, they were principled and disciplined, caring and kind. And my takeaway was it made me want to be a better dad, reading your stories about your own dad. What was it like to be able to tell their story in this format?
Well, I couldn't have been luckier in terms of both my mother and father. There is a change in that, we watch over our kids way more closely now. And so if you read the story, you may think, what? He's off hiking and, there's no cell phone?
I couldn't have imagined it. Yeah.
And, I was a page down in Olympia, although I lived with the Evans in the governor's mansion. I was a page in D.C. And, for a summer, and, that was a great exposure for me. And so kids, particularly boys, were allowed to go off and, be in different novel situations. And I benefited. My hiking friends, which were kind of Boy Scout friends, were different than my summer get-together called Cheerio that we did every summer, different than the kids at the church, and then at school, it's the primary thing. But I had sort of this sense of, okay, how do I fit into this group versus this other group? My parents encouraged me to talk to adults. And so my social skills that were slow to develop, I was much better at talking to adults than I was even to sort of most of my peer group. I mean, okay, some kids who were like me, like Kent, I was able to have great friendships with. But that thing of talking to adults, it comes from my parents having, lots of events at their house with friends or related to my dad's career. That was invaluable, that I would ask them questions. The way my dad would share lawsuits and, explain, okay, this is what antitrust means. It's like, oh, wow, so interesting.
Well, and it came into play in your relationship with MITS and the conversations with them, because you remembered that you put into the contract that they needed to make their best efforts.
Yeah.
Not just a good faith effort, but and that was really the thing that made you successful in the arbitration and really freed Microsoft up to sell BASIC to other companies. I mean, your dad, all along the way, he was almost like your informal general counsel in life and business in the early days.
He gave great advice, and it was actually a partner in his law firm, Bill Newcomb, who comes in. One of our great lawyers in Europe at Covington, Brad Smith, comes in, and
Right.
To this day, Brad is an incredible asset for the company. So, the number of things that worked perfectly, where my mom, is both encouraging but kind of, can't you do better than that, type influence. Many people with extreme success have some, almost trauma type thing that their childhood's very tough. In my case, the only really traumatic thing that happened to me when I was young was Kent Evans dying. Otherwise, I have a very stable house. I have an older sister who's super nice to me. I have a much younger sister, 9 years younger, who's, super nice and supportive. And, it's kind of an idealistic thing, including going to Lakeside, and the teachers there, you have like 15 in each class, but in many of my classes, I was getting, 20% of the teacher's time would be feedback to me or things that they said I should go off and read, so it's, kind of unbelievable.
And yet, I think you would acknowledge this, you were an extremely difficult kid to parent at times. Am I overstating that?
My parents, there were a period of about 3 or 4 years where they were befuddled. And, my dad, not much fazed him, but this idea of, okay, he was such an open-minded, ahead of his time person on so many things, but he was I could tell he was so confused. Should we discipline this kid more or discipline him less? And my mom's naturally like, no, we have to discipline him more. We have to get him to come into line. He has to get up here on time. My dad would be, maybe we should. I mean, he showed a solid front.
Yeah.
But I could tell that even he, who is calm all the time, I mean, the one time I was so sarcastic that he did get upset because it's so exceptional that he threw a glass of water at me. I was like, wow, that never happens. And boy, did I never create that circumstance ever again. Because, he was the so patient. But yeah, they were concerned about me and not sure what to do. I mean, you literally had teachers who, when I was sort of, not following along, they'd say, oh no, maybe we need to hold him back. And then the same year, a teacher saying, no, we should push him ahead at least a grade, maybe 2. So that's a little bit weird that teachers say, yes, he's very talented, but he's not kind of fitting in or, sitting there quietly like he should. And then things like table manners, which, why did she care about that? But she did. And so, that led to them having me see a therapist, Dr. Cressy, which that also worked out super well because he he, over a period of a year, and he did it in a very clear way, said, you're wasting your energy fighting your parents. They love you, therefore you win. And that isn't what you should be putting your energy into. And he was very nice to me. He gave me an IQ test. He had me read all these books. And I was like, oh God, you're right. And so by the time I was 13 or so, it did improve quite a bit. I wasn't saying, okay, why do you think you have authority over me? Why do you think you can tell me to do things? Which, why was I pushing back in that way? So it wasn't all just super smooth. And my mom, for all my life, she was always a little bit, hey, can you do this better? That was the dynamic that we had. And so those passages in the book where I'm saying, my mom was amazing. I was called Happy Boy. So I didn't want to paint it like, there's some, yelling and shouting, but I definitely confused my parents and caused them some angst, particularly during the periods I was saying, hey, you can't, why do you have the authority over me? Which, I viewed as arbitrary. And, so I kind of took it on with all my intelligence, which was troubling.
You also acknowledge toward the end of the book something that I don't think you've said publicly before, and so I wanted to ask you about this. You write, if I were growing up today, I'm sure that I would be diagnosed on the autism spectrum. Why was it important for you to write that or to say that publicly?
Well, I think it's, it's a level of honesty there that when I would do a 200-page Delaware report and I would turn that in, and everybody else's report's like 10 pages, I was like, oh, shoot,
Yours had a wooden cover.
Yeah, oh, mine was incredible. Maps and, key to my career has been my knowledge of Delaware. And so, so it's kind of embarrassing. And it's like, wow, I am different. Why did I do that? And kids can kind of, they're intimidated by it. So they kind of make fun of it. And, the fact that social situations, okay, who do I sit with and how do people perceive this thing and I'm miscuing, or even that I, when I'm thought still to this day, and people give me a hard time when I'm thinking hard without even, I'll start kind of rocking, which is kind of like a stimming, comforting behavior. I claim it's because, my parents put me to sleep on a rocking horse or had a rocking crib or something. But, yeah, there's no doubt there would have been a more formal notion of, okay, you're good at these things and not at these things. And I do think it's valuable for anybody who's different to see that, I was able to take that and make it a strength that, okay, I can ask adults questions, or I can go down and read this 500-page book and, try to make sure it fits in. And I have enough time to be very tough on myself. Do I really understand this? Could this code be 2 bytes shorter? What is the most elegant way? And to go through all those experiences where I was getting feedback, oh no, this is how you should write this code. It's this positive thing that hyper focus, if properly directed, is fantastic.
So the level of candor was one of the things that struck me about this book. But of course, this is just the first installment in your memoirs, and it's easy to look back on yourself as a kid and go, hey, oh, that was me and I've evolved. Do you think you'll be able to keep up this level of candor and introspection and self-criticism in the next installments about Microsoft and beyond?
Well, we'll see. One luxury of hyper success should be that you're willing to admit your shortcomings. And the whole evolution of how I manage people, there's a lot of, you could almost say mea culpa in that I managed other people like I manage myself, which is, work harder, be tougher, and don't waste time. If you know something, move on to the next thing. And it works for me managing me, but it only works with a very narrow set of other people who are like me. And so that, limits the kind of people you can have. And over time, I recognized that. I was so ridiculous, I thought, that I'd only have super high IQ people, and so everybody would know how to program. And, my illusions about that, were changed, fairly early on. So hopefully the evolution, I chose to stay as CEO of the company, and I think for good reason for a long time. And that's not typical. And that required my changing, learning, and building this team of people like John Shirley, who had, incredible skills. And even though I'd say, only Paul and Steve are without which there is no Microsoft, the luck we had of all those other great people, is an amazing story.
I talked to you in 2008 when I was a reporter for one of the newspapers, the Seattle PI, right when you were leaving Microsoft. We were fortunate enough to speak with you in your office on one of your last days. I asked you about the perception that you'd mellowed over time. And do you remember what you said?
Maybe, I hope not, or I'm embarrassed that that's true, or...
You said bullshit.
Okay, good. I think I was making a joke.
You were.
That is good.
It was a good one. It's one of my favorite lines, right up there with when a student at the University of Washington asked you what it's like to be a billionaire, and you said, it's the same hamburger. But have you mellowed further?
Well, certainly, I take more time off.
Yeah.
I play a lot of tennis. My contribution is less, individually coming up with the idea and more building teams around ideas, whether that's my advice to Microsoft, or I still do product reviews where I'll say, hey, this feature is stupid.
Do you just say it's stupid? You don't say it's the stupidest effing thing you've ever heard?
Just for fun. Like Brian McDonald, when we did a review, he said, hey, this might be one of his last, at least give me the honor of calling something the stupidest thing you've ever heard, which he was joking. It was a nice, piece of work that we were going over. No, but there are still product groups where I'll say, hey, this is a dead end. This is not how this thing should work. 80% of the meetings are, it's, mostly really good, fantastic, encouraging them and a little bit of course correction. There's very few nowadays, but there have, in the last year, I'd say there have been 5 where, I had to say to the management, even to Satya, no, I think this thing you've got the wrong people and the wrong approach. But yes, I've certainly mellowed. It's more of a generative thing, sharing mistakes I've made with other people where that might, help them deal with the challenge. And, I get to work with so many smart people. Breakthrough Energy's the one that I was never the hands-on person. Even with the foundation, there's a few areas like polio that I'm reasonably hands-on. Breakthrough Energy's always been this team that I created. And I love that one because, that team is so fantastic and it's gone very, very well. But, actually, that's pretty similar to Microsoft in that, it's like 20% of my time.
After the break, Bill Gates on the state of the world and the evolving role of the tech industry in global media and politics. It's Todd Bishop, and I wanted to tell you about a favorite podcast of mine. It's called Booming, and it's a show that has opened my eyes to a whole range of things, like what's really happening when I scan a digital coupon at the grocery store, and how robots are changing the construction of buildings in downtown Seattle, among many other topics. Booming is a podcast from KUOW Public Radio in Seattle. It's about the economic forces shaping our lives in the Pacific Northwest. It's co-hosted by reporters Joshua McNichols and Monica Nicholsberg. That's a familiar name and voice to longtime GeekWire readers and listeners. They answer questions that listeners are wondering about, like why are sports tickets so expensive? Or how hard should you actually work at work? Plus, every episode ends with a game. That's Booming from KUOW Public Radio. Find episodes on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts. I know we're reaching the end of our time in this conversation, and I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you for some of your broader worldview at this moment in the world. We're at a time of transition with the U.S. presidential administration. The Gates Foundation itself is in a time of transition with you taking over in the sole chair role with Melinda departing. Can you give me a sense for where your thoughts are these days in terms of the broader world, your philanthropic work, the political environment? Big question, I know, but I'd just like to get your thoughts if you could riff on that.
Well, my general impression is that all of the innovation that I get to work on, whether it's Microsoft, OpenAI, AI things, is going faster and better than I expected. At the foundation, we're learning about malnutrition. We think we can eventually cure HIV. There's all these things that happen during pregnancy, preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, so that, we're digging into that aren't just a problem in poor countries, but, we're gaining insights, new generations of vaccines that, use needle anyway. I could go on and on.
Yeah.
So innovation is going in climate, in software, and global health and agriculture is going faster than expected. And, that I love that because I get to meet with those teams and, make sure it doesn't just get out in rich countries, make sure it gets out very broadly. The world that we're delivering that innovation into is a less stable, more polarized world than I would have expected. And that's somewhat of a surprise to me. This naivete that the digital revolution would be all good, that, we because you can gather facts, that things would be more factual. In the early days, we were able to maintain, hey, it's just a tool and humans want good things, therefore giving them tools to do more is a good thing. Not until social networking comes along do you see, okay, girls criticizing each other and, crazy people finding each other and being at critical mass to stay crazy. Like, wow, there are some human behaviors that this is enabling that aren't necessarily good for society. Harari gives the example that when the printing press comes along, the books about how you kill witches and how there's witches outsold Copernicus's manuscript, 10,000 to 1. And so this naive view that it always, more is always good, this is not the first time. We have to think, no, unless you're very careful, some of these other things are a problem. For my foundation work, the focus on foreign aid and helping Africa, not only in the U.S., where potentially it could get reduced a lot, although I'm working, including talking to Trump about, hey, let's maintain this for many reasons. That generosity, even from European countries, is very much of a problem. The African countries are very indebted. So we've got this very tumultuous world. Sarcastically, I say, okay, this is the most interesting scenario because, there's so much up in the air, U.S., China, 10 years from now, complementary, peaceful.
Roll the dice.
AI and how that gets shaped. So I remain optimistic. The things in the health domain, both for rich countries and for developing countries. My work on Alzheimer's, we now have this blood test that we help fund that will be a very key tool, and the medicines are making great progress, including some work Eli Lilly and others are doing. So it's an exciting, interesting world, but there are some concerning trends.
And it strikes me that tech leaders are taking on an outsized role right now, other tech leaders in media, government, and politics. Elon Musk, Mark Benioff, Jeff Bezos. Obviously influencing government is nothing new, but the extent today seems striking. What's your take on that?
Well, I guess we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, if you put aside Aramco, the insight that working on software broadly defined would create these valuable companies, that's come true. The 7 most valuable companies are in this domain. Some like Apple and Microsoft, even Google, around for a long time. Some like NVIDIA, fairly new. Elon's company's medium new. And so it's created these fortunes of a scale. It's not just billionaire, 10 billionaire, 100 billionaire. It's even beyond that. And it's great that society's listening to people who understand AI because they should, be engaged in this ultimate change agent. I'm sure that it'll wane and wax. mean, there were definitely periods where the tech industry, when we go to Congress and say, this is important for us, they were like, both parties were out competing each other to accommodate us. Now, at least in some areas, for big tech, it's like, oh, this is what you want, we'll do the opposite. I mean, is big tech more influential or less influential? It's certainly talked about. It's around, it's important, but, there are lots of people trying to say, no, let's, curb this, not only in the United States, but elsewhere. And these companies appropriately are held to a very high standard. Thank God we have, people like Brad Smith who are helping us understand how we play as constructive a role and as we can.
And then lastly, you've gone through this process of introspection about your childhood, and you're going to be doing it through your Microsoft career and beyond. Has it changed how you're thinking about your own life from here, and how you're going to continue and ultimately finish this story of Bill Gates on planet Earth?
Well, turning 70, is stunning to me because in a certain sense, there were no old people in the personal computer industry. I mean, somebody in their 40s, like when I hired John Shirley, it's like, oh, this old guy, who actually is an adult. Let's see if we can fit him into this revolution. Now I feel like, wow, I still have some ability to understand and, even help guide these things a little bit. So, it's so different than when I was young thinking, okay, older people really could never figure out the important things. I probably have, with a little bit of luck, 20 years where I can play an active role. And so in my full-time job, which is the foundation job, Mark Suzman and I and the team over the course of this year will talk about what our goals are for the rest of this time, for the next 20 years, and say, okay, we have headwinds, but, our values and, the things we're going to stay, in those areas because, a lot of great things have happened. And so we'll, try and renew the vision of the foundation for the years ahead. So I'm excited to do that. The climate work, there'll be some policy things that are less favorable, but even so, I think the theory of innovation, making cheap, clean technology is one of the few things that survives the less willingness to subsidize. The IRA has a lot of good stuff in it that we'll see how much of that ends up being preserved. So that will be pretty exciting. But yeah, when you write a book like this, it does make you think, okay, boy, I have a limited amount of time. How do I want to take focus my time? Which goals do I want to work on? And I want to take the money that I'm lucky enough to have from Microsoft and have the foundation spend it, to the greatest impact possible.
The book is Source Code, My Beginnings. Bill Gates, thank you very much for talking with me.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with the rest of my interview with Bill Gates as part of our Microsoft at 50 series. Thanks to GeekWire collaborator Kevin Lisota for his help with this interview and for his photos, which you can see along with edited excerpts and video highlights from the conversation on the post for this episode at geekwire.com. If you're enjoying this conversation, be sure to rate and review the GeekWire podcast in Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to help bring the content to more people. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop. Thanks for listening to the GeekWire podcast.